Hey guys, so last week, many of you will remember that we had just finished up the section in chapter 29 on the civil rights movement for African Americans. So, moving forward, we're actually going to be looking at how this time period is going to spark a series of new movements that are geared towards different groups inside the United States who, at the time, really did not have the same rights that we see today. So, thanks to the African American civil rights movement, we're going to see a lot of inspiration for other groups to stand up and start fighting for their own equal rights in different aspects of life. So, you guys can see here the different groups that we're going to focus on in this next section of this chapter are going to be dealing with Native Americans, Mexican Americans, the women's rights movement, and then also individuals living with disabilities. So, we're going to start today with the American Indian movement to see what is going to happen for Native Americans across the country after they've been watching African Americans really fighting and becoming successful in their fights for civil rights. So, the Native American movement for civil rights, just to give you guys a little bit of background on why we're going to see such a massive movement spark in the Native American community. So, going back to the 1950s, I've got some statistics for you guys just to show really how difficult life was for most Native American tribes. So, unemployment rates for Native Americans were roughly 10 times higher than the national average. So these are all statistics looking at different tribes and tribal organizations for Native Americans. And if you guys remember, back when America was expanding west, we started to push a lot of Native tribes off of their lands to live on certain reservation sections. So this is looking at reservation data and also data from natives who've left reservations to go live in cities. Okay, so unemployment rate is about 10 times higher than the national average. They have a shorter life expectancy given the fact that they don't have the best um, medical systems or medical equipment or even medicines in general. If people get sick, it's going to be hard to treat them. Death rates due to this and due to issues like suicide, alcoholism, and different diseases is going to be extremely high, roughly 60 times higher than the national average, which is an alarming rate. They have extremely high rates of poverty, meaning that most people living on reservations live below that poverty line. Just really, really poor living conditions. And the situation is just very sad to see what a lot of Native Americans are left with. Many states are still not allowing Native Americans to vote. So if they don't have any kind of representation in government, they're not going to have anything to benefit them. They're not going to have anybody really fighting for their rights or their situation to improve. And this is kind of an interesting piece because Native tribes are still given some independence. And so it's kind of interesting to think about whether or not they do need the right to vote if they are going to be a part of the US government. So, this was going to be kind of a debate that a lot of states are going to have to carry out whether or not they're going to let natives actively participate in a government that they don't necessarily identify with. So this issue or these series of issues is going to cause a lot of divide among the Native American community and their tribes. So on one half, you've got several natives who start moving away from their tribal lands to cities because the situation on their tribal reservations are just so bad that they're looking for better situations for themselves or maybe a better future for their families. So they're going to start leaving these reservations and looking for places where they've got more opportunities to maybe find a job. The other half, though, a significant amount of Native Americans are still going to want to protect their history and protect their traditional rights that Native Americans had been granted. We had a series of roughly 400 treaties with Native American tribes through the majority of like the 1800s. So These treaties were granting Native Americans hunting rights, access to clean water, access to ceremonial or very spiritual locations, depending on the Native Americans' views of their religion. So they wanted to continue to protect those traditional beliefs. It's kind of like you and I, we've got our own family traditions and we've got our own histories. And so we find value in wanting to preserve that. So that's the same thing that a lot of Native Americans are going to be looking for, um, trying to protect their rights and their histories and their traditions. So, land rights is going to be a big issue. And based on hundreds of these treaties between the native tribes and their reservation groups and the United States governments, we were supposed to uphold these and allow natives to protect those land rights. But following World War II, we're going to have several congressmen representing some of these Western states that are looking to sell more and more land from their states to private companies that want to mine things like coal and oil for fuel purposes, and also uranium, which is going to be a type of element that is used in the development of nuclear weapons. So, kind of an interesting fact, but Utah actually was one of the states that was chosen to mine uranium. There's still some spots down south, I believe, on the San Rafael Swell, where you can find some of these old mining shacks where they used to go in and try to extract uranium. So the problem with this was some of the lands that these congressmen were wanting to sell off to these private companies to start mining access had actually belonged to Native Americans. So they were also saying that they wanted to see Native tribes become more self sufficient. So in the treaties, besides just granting them land rights, the United States also made a lot of promises to help run these reservation systems by providing them with government assistance or welfare assistance for things like medical equipment or food access. And so they're trying to say that on one hand, we want to move um, Native American land rights so that we can open this up for mining purposes and start making some money and start extracting materials that we need to start building and making America prosper. But on the other hand, they are really taking away a lot of the assistance that Native Americans really needed in order to run their tribes efficiently. And so this is going to leave a lot of Native American communities left with kind of nothing. And so it's going to spark a brand new movement to get some of these government policies shifted in order to uphold those treaties between Native tribes and the government that go back all the way to the 1800s. So, in order to protect Native American lands that had been promised in these tribes, we're going to see groups beginning to form in order to fight for the rights of Native Americans. In some ways, you guys are going to see some similarities between groups like the Black Panthers and the civil rights leaders of the African American movement. They're going to take a lot of inspiration from that to fight for Native American rights. So the group that is the most famous out of this movement for Native Americans is going to be called the American Indian Movement, or it's short for AIM, AIM. And they are going to push something that they referred to as red power. So, very similar to the whole concept of black power, they're going to be pushing for rights of Native Americans to continue to have access to their land rights that were granted to them in treaties. And they're also going to be fighting against things like issues we were seeing in cities, police brutality against natives, or judging Native Americans on the streets, and then therefore leading to confrontations between these people and the police officers often got kind of violent or got kind of brutal between the two sides. And so one thing that we said the Black Panthers did for African American community was kind of police the police, make sure that they were not being overly abusive with their powers. So AIM members are going to kind of follow suit and continue watching police officers to make sure that they're not getting too aggressive with Native Americans. So, one more thing that they are going to be very active in doing is occupying different places in forms of protest. And to occupy something is basically bring in a group of people that represent your organization, and you're going to stay there. It's kind of like a sit-in movement, but in some ways, these people are actually going to live in certain places for extended periods of time. So, occupying the places that they chose were going to be certain federal lands that were owned by the federal government, but had been abandoned. So there's kind of an interesting history to this. There was a treaty signed with the Sioux tribe and the United States government all the way back in 1868. And it was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And in this one treaty, the United States included a line that essentially said if there is ever federal land that is owned by the United States government that has served its purpose and is no longer in action, is completely abandoned by federal use, Native Americans have the right to reclaim that land. So AIM is going to take this, or the American Indian Movement is going to take this one piece of that treaty and justify their actions and their protest and how they're going to occupy certain federal places. Oh, sorry, I meant to put this guy in here. There we go. So, two places where we're going to see Native Americans occupying. One is going to be the old Alcatraz prison. So, some of you guys might remember talking about Alcatraz when we were in the 1920s and talking about gangsters. So, Alcatraz is a very famous high security prison that was used in the early half of the 1900s. And in 1963, it was completely closed down, and the federal government just left the facility. It's on an island off the coastline of San Francisco. So it's this big, like, concrete fortification that's just sitting there, and nobody has been using it. So the American Indian Movement, AIM, is going to decide to take over that island and stage a massive protest in an occupying movement. So they're going to get a bunch of Native American followers to go and essentially build camp and set up their own version of a reservation on this island where Alcatraz prison is or was built. So if you guys look up pictures today, oh, excuse me, if you look up pictures today, you can see some of the remnants, because when they moved in, a lot of natives decided to paint sides of the Alcatraz prison to say things like Native American Movement or AIM or Red Power, or all of these symbols that really represented their movement for Native American rights. So, one thing that they were doing was as a protest point to show how poor a lot of the situations were for living standards on reservations for Native Americans, was given the fact that Alcatraz was closed and had been closed for several years before this occupation takes place. There were no utilities, meaning there's no running water, there's no access to electricity. It's basically just a rundown shell of a building that used to hold a bunch of high security prisoners. So, as their protest point, AIM is going to say, well, basically, this shelter has the same quality as our reservations. Many of us do not have access to running water. Many of us do not have access to electricity. And some of those very basic living conditions that were mostly standard across the United States by this point, natives are saying that they're being left behind in the government assistance that they were promised. So, this occupation of Alcatraz will continue to go on for 19 months. They will live there until they're starting to get a lot of attention from the national government. The press catches hold of the story and starts running it like crazy. So there was actually a pretty big standoff between the natives and the United States government. And so the government's going to come in and forcibly remove these Native Americans, and actually a fire is going to break out in part of the building. So they're essentially evacuated and cannot return to Alcatraz, because what the government does is creates a national historic landmark, which is kind of like a monument, you could say. A national historic landmark is something that is designated under the National Park Service. So it's something that is protected for having some kind of historic value. So the government creates a landmark and basically says that this is protected and nobody can use it for living purposes, preventing any kind of American Indian movement members from moving back in to try to occupy the building once more. So after Alcatraz, another very highly covered, high stakes occupation that is linked to the AIM group is going to take place in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. So this is going to be, it's going to turn out being a more violent occupation. There's going to be some clashes between these groups. Some of the more um, volatile, I guess you could say, of the group, or some of the more aggressive members of the AIM group are going to start clashing with the FBI. So the FBI is going to be called in to start investigations once the occupation of Wounded Knee gets started. So Wounded Knee, the historic significance of this is that Wounded Knee was the last location of the Native American resistance movement in the 1800s. So there was an event that took place at Wounded Knee where the United States military will use cannons and weapons and attack unarmed Native Americans, women, children, elderly people, all alike were completely massacred at the site of Wounded Knee. So it has a lot of historic um, precedence to the Native American community because this was seen as a massive dark mark in their past, given the fact that they lost so many innocent lives. So for 70 days, or for over 70, I think it was about 73 days total, the American Indian movement is going to occupy this town after they had chosen kind of significant reasons to pick Wounded Knee, like I said, given the history behind it. They're going to occupy this town and kind of take it over from its inhabitants, the few people that lived there that were not Native American, and start setting up certain claims and certain demands that the federal government must adhere to. So the federal government's going to send in FBI agents and they're going to try to get this movement out of South Dakota because a lot of the locals had started to complain about the occupation that natives were carrying out in this location. So I think by the end of it, there were several days where it got violent between the two sides and open gunfights will start. I think roughly 6 people were killed in one shootout between the AIM group and the FBI. So this fight has started to get pretty intense between the two sides. And we're not seeing a whole lot being done for Native American rights, but it is sparking a national conversation about whether or not Indians really truly have right to some of the access or some of the lands that they were supposed to access given the fact that they had signed these treaties with the United States government. So by the end of the Red Power movement, when we start seeing groups like AIM kind of washing out, we're starting to lose a lot of the speed. Demonstrations by Native tribes had gotten the federal government's attention and they had started to agree to work a little bit more to protect Native American rights to their land. So issues where Western congressmen were wanting to sell off land to access for mining rights, we're going to see the government start to kind of back down on some of those ideas and uphold the treaties that Native Americans had been granted access to things like water on different rivers to have for fishing purposes or freshwater, hunting lands, etc. So this is going to happen during the Nixon administration when Richard Nixon was president. And he also vows to make tribes more self-sufficient. So this is kind of going off of that issue where Congress wanted to get natives off of a lot of government welfare assistance. But in order to do that, they needed to help improve the conditions on the reservations to begin with. So he's also saying that he's not going to enforce some policies terminating tribal ownership of lands. That would be in the instance of trying to sell those lands off to mining companies. So we don't see a whole lot of super successful things coming out of this movement like we did with the African American movement for civil rights when they gained better voting rights, getting rid of old Jim Crow laws. But we will see this surge of pride for Native American culture, and that's going to continue even up to today, we still see a massive instance of pride in a lot of these reservation systems where they want to hold on to those customs and those traditions. And it was something to encourage them to continue fighting to protect their rights that were granted to Native American communities in those some 400 treaties between their tribal organizations and the United States government. So we're going to cut it off here for today, and we will pick back up with the Mexican American movement tomorrow.